Hello. Today I want to share how I used Ancestry DNA and 23andMe to discover the true identity of my father's biological father. This is a follow-up video to, a series of videos I've done about my genealogical journey going back to 2007, and I suppose this one is a conclusion to that. I've chosen to release the video on the 31st of July, 2023, because that is actually the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's birth. I think it would be good to give a bit of background to this story for those who are not familiar with it. I never knew my father because he was in prison in the United States from the time of my birth until his death in 2003. He was not part of my life in any way. In fact, I only met him once when I was 21. Like many people who are missing a parent, I always had a need to know who that parent was. It was a bit tricky in my case because my father led an inconsistent and unstable life. He had no family ties and was unwilling and unable to provide an honest account of his background to anyone. Those closest to him seemed to know the least about him. In the late 90s, I wrote him and asked for information on his background. However, he was very unhelpful, to put it mildly, and so I looked elsewhere. Beginning in the early 2000s, I submitted dozens of information requests to various law enforcement agencies, courts, and other public institutions across the United States. I found a lot. In fact, I have half a filing cabinet full of research, but very little of this presented a picture of a redeemable man. Indeed, some things should be forgotten, especially when it's not your burden. Sometimes the past is really left in the past for a reason. My father may have been a write-off, but I still needed to know my background, so I shifted my focus instead to his family. Specifically, the identity of his parents, my paternal grandparents. One of the challenges was that my father used several names throughout his life. My last name, Christopher, for example, was the name he happened to be using at the time of my birth. I love my name. It's my name. I'm not willing to change it, and I'm happy with it, but that's the story of it. I learned that he was born in Phoenix City, Alabama, in June 1941 to an unmarried waitress and an unknown father. Shortly after his birth, he was adopted by a couple named Roby Wesley Henderson and Carrie Elizabeth Gully, who named him Tommy Robert Henderson. That was my father's legal name. At this time, I still didn't know much else, so in 2007, I visited his hometowns of Phoenix City, Alabama, and Columbus, Georgia, in an effort to find more information about his background. I thought maybe I could find something if I went there in person. I found a few documents in the courthouse, but I could not find anyone who remembered my father or his family. They had either died or moved away. That being said, I had a wonderful trip. Many of the people there showed me great hospitality, generosity, and courtesy. Additionally, when I explored the forests and swamps just outside of Phoenix City, I felt a strong and deeply comforting sense of familiarity. It was as if the trees and wind were saying, "Welcome, you are part of this place." I knew right then and there in the forests of Russell County, Alabama, that I had very deep roots in that place. This feeling, this experience, and not my father, would be my lodestar. My physical presence in that place affirmed that I was on to something positive. Instead of focusing on my father, I could focus on this place and the memories I made there. I would love to return one day. The following year, in 2008, I learned that my father's adoption took place across the river in Columbus, Georgia. So, in 2009, the Adoption Reunion Registry provided me with my father's mother's name, which was Peggy Glendora Brooks. In 2010, I obtained my father's sealed adoption file from the state of Alabama, where he was born. Those records confirmed that my father's name at birth was Tommy Robert Brooks, and that his mother, Peggy Glendora Brooks, was unmarried. Unfortunately, my father's father was not mentioned anywhere in those documents. I wrote about that experience on my blog back in 2010. There is a link in the description, or you could just search Anatomy of a Sealed Adoption File, and it should come up. Unfortunately, my grandmother died in 1990, but I was able to connect with her family and remain in regular contact with them to the present day. They are really nice people. I really like them. Additionally, I have filled out that side of my family tree quite nicely. That being said, I still had a huge gap and didn't know my real name, quote-unquote, aka my paternal surname. And that was very important to me. A lot of people ask, what's your real name? And I didn't have an answer. In the early 2010s, I was not sure how or if I would ever find that information. Anyone who had first-hand knowledge of my father's birth was either long dead or unwilling to disclose what they knew, and there was no documentary evidence, at least that I could find. It was a dead end. But that all changed in 2016 when I took an Ancestry.ca DNA test and identified some of my father's paternal relatives for the first time. That was a huge moment. Fortunately, several people on my mother's and paternal grandmother's sides had already submitted Ancestry DNA tests, so I was able to quickly identify and group any matches that were on my paternal grandfather's side. I'm going to use a series of charts to show you some of those matches and how I use them to determine the identity of my paternal grandfather. I'm going to be using the term centimorgan a lot in this video, which is a unit to measure genetic linkage. The higher the centimorgans shared, the closer the relative. For example, I share 3,460 centimorgans with my mother, 2,743 centimorgans with a full sibling, and 1,600 centimorgans with my maternal grandmother and half-sibling. The rule is that if you share more than 60 centimorgans with a DNA match, there is a very high chance that you share a recent common ancestor. My first three closest DNA matches for my paternal grandfather's side were 68 centimorgans, 71 centimorgans, and 79.6 centimorgans, as you can see here. Those results indicate that the matches could be anywhere from my second cousins to third cousins once removed. My first order of business was to figure out the most recent common ancestors for those matches. Fortunately, all of my new cousins had their family trees posted to Ancestry, and I was able to use that information to determine that my two closest matches were each other's second cousins, and the third a more distant relative. Their most recent common ancestors were Joseph Kramer and Martha E. Lett of Chambers County, Alabama. They were the second great-grandparents of my two closest matches and the great-grandparents of my third closest match. When you look at these matches, you may notice that 7 out of 10 of the 11 ancestors have the surname Kramer, also pronounced Kramer. That was my first aha moment. I figured there was a good chance that Kramer may have been my paternal grandfather's surname. So I did an extensive research project on all of these people on Ancestry and zeroed in on any Kramer relatives who spent a significant amount of their lives in the Phoenix City, Columbus area. That happened to be William Thomas Kramer, who was born in 1883 and died in 1971. That's his photo right there. It was taken, I believe, by his granddaughter. Back in 2016, I did a ton of research on him and thought that perhaps he may have been my grandfather. So I reached out to one of his granddaughters, who I affectionately call Cousin Violet. She graciously shared copies of every family photo that she had, as well as many stories. I am so grateful to know her. I hope to meet her one day, and at the time I was really hoping that WT was my grandfather because that would have made her a rather close relative as a first cousin, so thanks to her for everything. My closest match was WT Kramer's grandson. However, we only shared 79.6 centimorgans. If WT was in fact my grandfather, that number would be a lot higher. He wasn't my grandfather, but he may have been my great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather. WT had 7 children in total, including Roy and Isla Elizabeth with his first wife Annie Swindle. He had 5 more children with his second wife Hattie Mae Causey, including Willie Eddy, Martha Emmerline, Violet Leo, Tommy Eugene, and Barney Otto. All of my DNA matches on my paternal grandfather's side were descendants of 4 of W.T. Kramer's children. The 79.6 centimorgan match was a grandchild of W.T. and Annie through their daughter Isla Elizabeth Kramer. However, I soon discovered an even stronger match with a great-great-grandchild of W.T. Kramer and his second wife, Hattie Mae Causey. Here's a photo of her. This led me to believe that I was likely a great or great-great-grandchild of William T. Kramer and Hattie Mae Causey. Here are some matches that I share with their descendants, early matches. Eventually, I matched with someone on 23andMe with whom I share 265 centimorgans of DNA. I was very excited about this match, so I reached out to him, and he confirmed that he is the grandson of William T. and Hattie Mae's youngest son, Barney Otto Kramer, who was born in 1925 and died in 1986. This looked like a second cousin to me, which means that William T. and Hattie Mae were in fact my great-grandparents. In the early 2020s, I matched with another person on 23andMe with whom I share 427 centimorgans of DNA. That's a very strong connection, which is within the realm of a half-first cousin, in other words, someone with whom I share a single grandparent. So, I reached out to her, and she confirmed that her father is the son of Tommy Eugene Kramer, who was born in 1923 and died in 1981. Here is a photo of him. It's the only one I could find. When I received that match, I had this sense that Tommy was, in fact, my grandfather. I looked him up on Ancestry and newspapers.com and dug up every little thing I could. I quickly found his Social Security application. When I looked at his signature on that old yellow document, I felt this keen chill. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this sense that Tommy Eugene was my grandfather. Suddenly everything came together and made perfect sense. Of course, he had the same name as my father. There was a clue in plain sight the whole time. But I wasn't ready to say that Tommy Eugene was my grandfather with any certainty until I had further evidence. He had 2 sons with his second wife, Ophelia Phyllis Hogsett. Fortunately, they are both still living, so I contacted them and asked if they would be willing to take a DNA test to help me figure this out. The youngest son, also named Tommy, graciously agreed. When his test results came back, it showed that we share 661 centimorgans of DNA, which is comfortably within the range of half-uncle. I accepted this result as confirmation that Tommy Eugene Kramer was, in fact, my paternal grandfather. Here is a family tree to see how I am related to my closest relatives, my closest DNA relatives. And here is a tree to show how I am related to Tommy Eugene Kramer. It's pretty straightforward. There is more evidence of how I am, in fact, related to him outside of DNA sources, and I will do other videos about that if there is sufficient interest in this one. For most of my life, the identity of my paternal grandfather was a mystery that seemed like it would never be solved. However, it is a mystery no more thanks to the advances in genetic genealogy and the growing popularity of these tests. Discovering this truth was a profound experience. The truth was revealed to me and thus became inevitable and permanent. When I started this search over 20 years ago, I think I was looking for a connection with my family. Above all, I was looking outside of myself to figure out who and what I was and where I belonged. However, as I grew and evolved as a person, this mattered less and less. And at the end of the day, it's just a wonderful hobby that I enjoy that connects me to other people who share this interest, like you watching this video. So at the end of the day, I found a name and this connection right here and now, and couldn't be happier. We're all looking for something, and I guess the lesson here is that sometimes you can find answers and that can be good. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day wherever you are.